Robert Milton had always believed that architecture was less about concrete and steel and more about the quiet dialogue between people and the spaces they inhabited. For most of his career, he had devoted himself to restoring old civic buildings, preserving details others would have gladly demolished, and fighting against the creeping anonymity of modern design. His colleagues sometimes called him stubborn, others called him old-fashioned, but Robert wore those labels without complaint. He had never been one to chase fashion or easy recognition. He wanted permanence, something that would remain standing long after his name was forgotten. It was that same pursuit of meaning that brought him, after a long and weary divorce, into a modest suburban neighborhood where he hoped to rebuild his private life in peace. The house was not grand, not remarkable by architectural standards, but it had a wide lawn and enough sunlight to make it feel alive. And, most importantly, it was his alone, untouched by anyone else's vision. When he first walked across the uneven grass, he already saw in his mind the changes he would make. Repairing the cracked porch, planting a row of elms to shield the windows from the harsh afternoon glare, and, most importantly, installing a flagpole. At the center of the yard, not as a patriotic display in the loud sense, but as a carefully crafted piece of design, a replica of a 19th century model he had once studied while working on the restoration of a courthouse. For Robert, the pole was not decoration. It was a symbol of continuity, a way of connecting his home with the broader story of the country and, on a personal level, with the countless buildings he had given years of his life to preserve. The process of installing it took weeks, not because it was difficult, but because he insisted on precision. He designed the foundation himself, calculating the stress loads as if it were part of a skyscraper rather than a simple residential feature. When the pole finally rose upright, gleaming softly in the morning light, he felt a rare satisfaction that had nothing to do with clients or deadlines. It was the kind of satisfaction that reminded him why he had become an architect in the first place: the ability to shape something honest, something that would stand outside of fashion and argument. Neighbors passed by while he worked, some offering polite smiles, others watching with the blank suspicion suburban streets often harbor toward any deviation from routine. Robert paid them little attention, assuming time would accustom them to his presence. He was, after all, not a man of spectacle. His life was quiet, his habits steady, his voice measured. The flagpole was meant to be the same, quiet but firm, visible yet dignified. The first real sign of conflict came not from an angry word shouted over a fence, but from a neatly folded letter slipped under his door late one evening. The paper bore the seal of the Homeowners Association, an entity he had only vaguely acknowledged until then, believing it to be a minor bureaucratic formality rather than a power with teeth. The letter spoke of aesthetic standards and neighborhood harmony, couched in the bland tone of administrative language, but the meaning was sharp enough. His flagpole was out of compliance with the visual code of the community. Robert read it twice, not because the words were difficult, but because they seemed unreal, as if someone had confused his property with another. There was no regulation forbidding flagpoles outright. At most, there were restrictions on height and material, both of which he had respected with care. What unsettled him more than the accusation was the casual arrogance of the phrasing, the assumption that a committee of strangers could dictate not only the paint on his shutters, but also the symbols he chose to raise above his home. For a man who had spent his life defending structures against careless destruction, the letter carried the sour taste of irony. He might have ignored it entirely had it not been for the final line, a request to attend the upcoming association meeting, where the matter would be discussed. Robert decided he would go, not to plead, but to clarify, perhaps even to educate them, about the history behind his choice. He imagined a civil conversation, a chance to explain that what stood on his lawn was not an arbitrary piece of metal, but a considered gesture rooted in architectural tradition. In his mind, reason would suffice. Surely his neighbors, ordinary people with ordinary concerns, would see that his project was not a threat, but an enrichment. Yet beneath that calm rationalization stirred a faint unease, the same unease he had felt years earlier when developers spoke of demolishing irreplaceable stone facades and replacing them with glass boxes. He had learned then that reason was not always welcome where authority had already decided. At the meeting, he introduced himself politely, outlined his background, and spoke briefly about the significance of the design. The faces around the table were unreadable, the kind of faces that attend out of obligation rather than interest. Only one person responded with energy. The chairwoman, a woman in her late 50s named Karen Pitcher, whose smile carried the tautness of someone used to being obeyed. She interrupted him halfway through his explanation, remarking that historical replicas had no place in a neighborhood striving for a modern, streamlined aesthetic. Her tone was not hostile in volume, but in certainty, as if the matter had already been decided before he walked in. Robert felt the eyes of the others turn away, some in embarrassment, others in indifference. When the meeting ended, he left without argument, unwilling to beg for approval over something that was not theirs to grant. Still, as he walked back across the darkening street, he realized that the letter had not been a polite warning, but a declaration of intent. The association had noticed him, and more specifically, Karen had noticed him. And if the flicker of disdain in her eyes was any indication, she would not be content until the flagpole was gone. The first days after the association meeting passed in uneasy silence, and Robert, though irritated by Karen's smug dismissal of his explanation, convinced himself that the issue would eventually dissolve the way many small neighborhood disputes do, in murmurs and shrugs that fade into routine. He continued his daily work at the drafting table he had set up in the back room of the house, sketched outlines for upcoming projects, and tended to the details of his yard as if nothing had changed. Yet something intangible had shifted. Neighbors who had once greeted him with neutral politeness now hesitated before lifting a hand or offered quick nods before retreating indoors. And, though Robert was not by nature suspicious, he began to sense that the letter had marked him in their eyes as if the flagpole were not a simple structure of metal and rope, but a declaration of defiance. He refused to bend to that perception, but the atmosphere was undeniable, the kind of subtle estrangement that spreads quietly through a community when one person is branded a rule breaker. It was on a Tuesday morning, bright and sharp with early sunlight, that the unspoken conflict transformed into an unmistakable act. Robert rose at his usual hour, brewed coffee, and stepped onto the porch with his mug, ready to enjoy the familiar sight of the flag stirring gently in the breeze. Instead, he found the lawn, scarred and empty. The pole, which had stood proudly upright only the night before, lay in two pieces across the grass, its base sheared cleanly through with the kind of precision only a power tool could achieve. The flag itself had been tossed aside like discarded laundry, half sunk into the damp soil, streaked with mud as if whoever had taken it down had gone out of their way to make its condition seem pathetic. For a moment, Robert stood motionless, the mug heavy in his hand, his mind struggling to reconcile the brutality of the scene with the quiet suburb around him. He set the mug down on the porch rail, walked slowly across the yard, and knelt beside the broken pieces, running his fingers across the raw cut. The steel had not bent or splintered. It had been deliberately sawn through, not the work of accident or weather, but of someone who had come in the night with a plan. His first instinct was disbelief. Who would take the trouble to commit such a calculated act over something so harmless? Yet disbelief gave way almost instantly to anger, a heat rising in his chest at the arrogance it implied. Whoever had done this had not only destroyed property he had crafted with care, they had done so in a way meant to humiliate, to reduce his symbol to rubble in front of the entire neighborhood. The tag tied around the severed base confirmed what his gut already knew. A laminated orange slip bearing the stamped letters, "Property of HOA," attached with a plastic tie as if this were the removal of an abandoned car rather than a personal possession on private land. Robert tore the tag free, crushed it in his fist, and felt the edge of resolve harden. This was not a misunderstanding, not a mistake of paperwork. This was an intentional strike, sanctioned or at least performed under the flag of the Homeowners Association, and the certainty of that realization clarified his next steps with brutal simplicity. He carried the flag carefully inside, washed the dirt from its fabric, and laid it flat across his dining table to dry, treating it with the reverence of an artifact rescued from ruin. Then, after allowing his anger to settle into cold determination, he returned to the yard to inspect further. There were faint impressions in the soil, not the tracks of a single person but of at least two, heavy enough to suggest equipment had been carried. Near the street, he noticed tire marks where a vehicle had briefly mounted the curb, and in his mind the image crystallized: a team, likely contracted or acting on instruction, arriving in the night with tools and orders, dismantling what they had no right to touch, and leaving with the smugness of people convinced that their authority protected them from consequence. By late morning, he was at the HOA office, a converted single-story building that looked more like a forgotten branch library than the seat of local power, yet inside it buzzed with the officiousness of clerks and volunteers who behaved as if they were gatekeepers of a kingdom. At the reception desk, he asked for an explanation, his tone measured but his eyes sharp, and the receptionist, a woman with hair pinned so tightly it seemed to stretch her expression into permanent disapproval, informed him that removal had been Yudgindema, authorized under the association's guidelines for unauthorized structures. When he pressed for documentation, she produced a thin folder with startling efficiency, flipping to a page that bore his name alongside the words "non-compliant installation." The signature beneath the line where his acknowledgement should have been was a crude forgery of his own hand, close enough that a casual glance might accept it, but poor enough to make his stomach churn with insult. He pointed at the page, demanded to know how such a lie had been filed, and received only a shrug in response, as though the matter were settled and any protest irrelevant. It was at that moment that Karen herself appeared from an interior office, her presence radiating the same sharp-edged confidence he had felt at the meeting. She greeted him with mock surprise, her voice layered with condescension as she explained that safety concerns had made the removal necessary, concerns about underground lines and aesthetic disruption. When Robert countered that there were no lines beneath his lawn and that no one had ever inspected, she simply smiled with the serenity of someone who never expects to be contradicted. "The decision was made collectively," she said, tapping the folder with one manicured finger. "You agreed to it, as you can see." The implication that he was complicit in the destruction of his own work was more infuriating than the act itself. He demanded the names of those who had voted, the minutes of the meeting, the source of the alleged safety concerns, and received only the same unyielding smile. Robert left the office with the folder in his possession. He had insisted on taking it, refusing to leave without evidence, and walked back into the heat of the day with his mind seething. Each page of the file was a mockery of due process: falsified signatures, vague citations of visual disharmony, ambiguous notes that seemed crafted less to explain than to obfuscate. It was not bureaucracy, he realized, but theater, a performance staged to create the illusion of legitimacy where none existed. He thought of the flagpole, of the hours he had spent measuring and aligning, and felt as though someone had not merely destroyed a piece of metal but had spit directly on his craft, on the very values that defined him. That evening, as dusk settled over the neighborhood and the broken remnants of the pole lay stacked against the side of his house, Robert stood at the window watching the streetlights flicker on. Across the road he saw silhouettes moving behind curtains, neighbors glancing toward his yard with furtive curiosity, whispering behind closed doors about the man who had already become a pariah for daring to resist the order of things. He understood then that what had been done was not meant simply to remove a structure, but to send a message: comply or be crushed. Yet he was not a man who had spent decades preserving endangered stone only to bow before a petty tyrant in a suburban office. The message he received was not submission, but challenge, and in the quiet of his living room, beneath the flag now clean and folded neatly across his table, he vowed that the pole would rise again, not as a simple restoration, but as an answer, a statement no falsified document could erase. The days that followed the destruction of the flagpole brought with them a heavier tension, not in dramatic confrontations on the street, but in the subtle erosion of trust that Robert could sense every time he stepped outside. The neighbors, once content to exchange the small pleasantries that made suburban life tolerable, now seemed to avoid his gaze entirely, as if his presence carried some unspoken contagion. It was not open hostility, but the kind of silence that is worse than argument, because it implied that the narrative had already been written without him, and that in that narrative he was the villain. Robert carried himself with the same quiet dignity he always had, but inside he was bracing against the weight of isolation. It was clear to him that the association had not only struck at his property, but had framed him in the eyes of others as the unreasonable one, the man who refused to play by the rules. He refused to let that story stand uncontested. The folder he had taken from the HOA office lay spread across his drafting table, its forged signature staring back at him like a personal insult. He studied every line, every date, every vague citation of compliance standards, and slowly pieced together the extent of the deception. Not only had his name been falsified on an authorization page, but the minutes of the supposed meeting contained details that betrayed their own fabrication. The listed attendees included a neighbor who had moved out months earlier, and the timestamps contradicted the association's own published schedule. What unsettled Robert even more was the ease with which these documents had been assembled, as though forgery were not an extraordinary act but a routine tactic used to bulldoze dissent. He had dealt with careless developers before, men who cut corners and bribed inspectors, but this felt different. It was not about profit on a grand scale, but about control wielded in the smallest of territories, control so obsessive that it justified rewriting reality itself. His first step was to request an official review of the documents. He drafted a letter, written in precise legal language, demanding a copy of the vote records and verification of the signatures. He sent it not only to the HOA office but also to the county registrar, believing that if the association was reckless enough to forge his name, they might have been careless in filing the paperwork. The response was swift, but not reassuring. From the registrar, he received a polite but evasive note explaining that the association handled its own internal compliance and that the county had no authority to intervene unless the matter escalated into a formal lawsuit. From the HOA, he received a letter dripping with manufactured civility, stating that his concerns had been noted, but that the decision was final and irreversible. The letter concluded with a reminder that continued non-cooperation could result in fines, a phrase that struck him as both absurd and sinister. Robert decided to confront the matter directly, not through more correspondence, but through his own presence. At the next association meeting, he arrived early, carrying with him not only the folder but also a binder of his own documents. Property records, architectural plans, and a copy of the original survey of the neighborhood that clearly showed no underground lines near his lawn. He had no intention of being theatrical, but he would not be silenced either. When the meeting began, he rose and presented his case with the same steady authority he once used to defend historic buildings before city councils. He explained the inconsistencies in the minutes, pointed out the impossibility of signatures belonging to absent residents, and demanded to know who had authorized the midnight dismantling of his property. For a brief moment, the room seemed to shift, the other residents glancing at one another with unease, as if his words had cracked the seamless facade of authority they had been taught to accept. But Karen, seated at the head of the table with her habitual air of superiority, cut through the moment with a voice sharpened by years of command. She accused him of overreacting, of misinterpreting routine procedures, of manufacturing grievances out of pride. She held up a page from the file, pointing to his forged signature with the casual confidence of someone daring him to deny it. "This is your acknowledgement," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "Perhaps you don't remember signing, or perhaps you wish now to withdraw, but the record stands." The insinuation that he was either forgetful or dishonest drew a murmur from the others, not loud but enough to reassert the invisible wall between him and them. Robert felt his jaw tighten as he responded with calm but cutting precision. "That signature is not mine, and you know it." Yet the effect was muted. Karen smiled as though his protest were nothing more than a tantrum, then moved briskly to the next item on the agenda, brushing aside his presence as if he were an inconvenience rather than a member of the community. The humiliation was sharp, but sharper still was the realization that reason alone would not suffice. The association had written its script, and Karen was determined to play her part to the end. Robert understood that if he simply rebuilt the flagpole, it would be torn down again, perhaps more violently, and if he argued in meetings, he would be drowned in procedural jargon and feigned civility. The battle was no longer about the physical structure but about narrative, about who held the authority to decide what was allowed to exist. And Karen's authority rested not on truth but on the passivity of those around her, neighbors too weary or too afraid to challenge her dominance. That night Robert walked the perimeter of his yard, studying the scar where the pole had once stood. The soil was still loose from the removal, a wound in the lawn that seemed to mock him with its emptiness. He crouched down, pressing his palm against the earth, and considered his options. He could retreat, accept the loss, and live quietly within the rules Karen imposed. Or he could resist, not through anger or spectacle, but through a meticulous strategy that would turn their own obsession with rules against them. The thought gave him a flicker of satisfaction, the same satisfaction he once felt when uncovering a structural flaw in an opponent's argument and watching the edifice collapse under its own contradictions. The decision crystallized with a clarity that left no room for hesitation. He would not rebuild the flagpole as it had been, vulnerable to midnight raids and forged documents. Instead, he would find a way to restore it on terms they could not easily erase, to anchor it not only in the ground but in the fabric of the very system Karen manipulated. She had made the first escalation by turning bureaucracy into a weapon. Now it was his turn to escalate, and he would do so with the precision of an architect and the patience of a man who had spent a lifetime ensuring that fragile structures survived against forces far greater than suburban pettiness. The broken pieces of the pole leaned against his house like discarded bones. But in his mind they had already risen again, taller and stronger, a challenge not only to Karen's authority but to the culture of silent submission that allowed her to wield it. Robert had always trusted in the idea that truth, when revealed with enough clarity, would eventually force even the most stubborn opponents to yield. But the weeks following the public humiliation at the HOA meeting taught him a more bitter lesson. Truth, when ignored by those with the power to enforce rules, became little more than another piece of paper to be shuffled into silence. The forged signature, the fabricated minutes, the smug dismissal of his protests, these things did not fade as he expected. They hardened into a narrative that painted him as unstable, the lone dissenter who clung to symbols rather than the good of the neighborhood. He heard whispers when he walked to collect his mail, saw curtains shift when he stepped onto his porch, and though no one confronted him directly, the isolation grew heavier each day. Yet within that isolation, something sharpened inside him, a refusal to be erased, a stubborn insistence that if the association sought to bury his voice under paperwork and ridicule, he would dig beneath their foundation and reveal what they preferred to hide. One evening, unable to rest, Robert pulled from a drawer the old survey maps of the neighborhood that he had requested months earlier when first considering the purchase of the property. He had studied them then only to understand the land he was buying, but now, with the eye of suspicion honed by betrayal, he noticed something curious. The parcel boundaries of the HOA office itself were oddly drawn, its building sitting partially over the line that separated private plots from a strip of land designated as municipal utility property. At first, he assumed it was an error in the aging map, but the more he compared it to the modern plats available online, the clearer it became that the building's foundation had indeed spilled beyond its proper boundary. The discovery did not immediately thrill him. Instead, it filled him with a grim recognition that those who barked most loudly about compliance were themselves standing on shaky ground. It was not enough to topple Karen and her committee, but it was a thread worth pulling. Driven by the possibility of leverage, Robert visited the county records office, a place where dust and silence seemed to thicken the air, and after hours of poring through drawers of microfilm and brittle folders, he found building permits from decades ago. They revealed what he had suspected. The association office had originally been approved as a smaller structure, later expanded without updated filings. The addition, the very wing where Karen's private office now sat, extended into the municipal strip without formal authorization. It was a technicality, perhaps, but in the language of bureaucracy that Karen worshipped, technicalities were the bricks and mortar of power. He left the office with copies in hand, his pulse steady with the satisfaction of an architect uncovering the hidden fault lines of a building. The knowledge alone was not enough. It needed to be transformed into action, and Robert understood that if he presented it at another meeting, he would be drowned again in smiles and dismissals. Instead, he decided to act in a manner that mirrored the language Karen herself used. He would make a statement not of complaint, but of presence, visible, undeniable, and perfectly within the boundaries of legality. He spent several nights sketching, not for a client but for himself, diagrams of how the flag could be raised again in a way that would resist easy destruction. He considered his options with the careful mind of a craftsman. A concealed foundation, a telescoping pole, even a series of smaller banners spread across his yard, but each idea felt insufficient, too timid for the insult he had endured. Then his eyes drifted to the copied permits lying on his desk, the proof that the association office stood partly on land it had no right to occupy, and the thought struck him with startling clarity. If they claimed his flag did not belong on his lawn, then he would place it where it could not be ignored, on the roof of the very building that embodied their false authority. The plan was not born from impulse, but from discipline. He contacted an old acquaintance from his years in architecture, a structural engineer named David, who had once consulted with him on courthouse restorations, and under the guise of discussing a personal project, he asked detailed questions about roof loads, temporary supports, and anchoring methods. David, unaware of Robert's true intent, offered advice freely, warning him to consider wind shear and weight distribution. Armed with that knowledge, Robert designed a mounting base that could be attached to the office's flat roof without puncturing the membrane, a structure that in any technical review would qualify as a temporary architectural element rather than a permanent installation. He ordered the necessary materials quietly, paying in cash and arranging deliveries to a rented storage unit rather than his home, cautious not to provide Karen with the satisfaction of spying on his preparation. The night of the installation arrived weeks later under a sky thick with stars, the streets silent except for the hum of insects. Robert had recruited no conspirators save one, a local handyman named Luis who occasionally did subcontracting for him and whom he trusted not for loyalty but for discretion. Together they loaded the segments of the pole, the mounting base, and the heavy bolts into the back of a truck, driving with headlights dimmed until they reached the association office. The building, modest and unguarded, seemed almost to invite the intrusion, its smug facade oblivious to the irony about to crown it. They worked in silence, hauling the materials up a narrow maintenance ladder and onto the flat expanse of roof. Robert's hands moved with the precision of decades, tightening bolts, aligning supports, hoisting the pole segment by segment until it rose against the night sky, a silver line catching the moonlight. When at last the flag unfurled, snapping gently in the breeze, Robert felt a surge that was not triumph but something deeper, the satisfaction of having inscribed his defiance directly onto the heart of his enemy's authority. By dawn, the installation was visible to the entire neighborhood, the flag towering above the association office like an uninvited truth. Residents emerged from their homes, some staring in confusion, others with faint smiles they quickly concealed. When Karen arrived, immaculate as always, her expression collapsed into disbelief before hardening into fury. She marched inside, barking orders into her phone, summoning contractors to dismantle the structure. Yet when they arrived, they hesitated. The design bore every mark of professional planning, its components labeled as temporary scaffolding supports, its permits, copies of municipal guidelines Robert had anticipated, taped in a clear sleeve to the base. Removing it without cause would expose the office itself to questions about its own legitimacy. The contractors muttered among themselves, refusing to act without clearer authorization, and one even gestured toward the municipal line markers at the edge of the property, subtly indicating that the office's precarious position made any intervention risky. Robert watched from a distance, his arms crossed, not gloating but steady, as Karen's fury met the immovable wall of her own hypocrisy. For years she had wielded compliance as a weapon, bending rules to break others, but now the rules shielded the very defiance she despised. The flag rippled above her office, undeniable, a silent testimony to the fact that authority built on deception could not withstand precision and patience. For Robert, this was not the end of the conflict, but it was the turning point, the moment when the battle ceased to be one man against a machine, and became instead a reckoning between truth and the hollow power of those who sought to silence it. The flag remained on the roof of the HOA office for days, and its very persistence began to gnaw at Karen more than its sudden appearance ever had. In the beginning, she convinced herself that it was a stunt that could be quietly erased, a piece of theater erected by a stubborn man that would collapse as soon as she summoned the right people to dismantle it. But when the contractors balked, and the municipal boundary issue surfaced in whispered conversations, her confidence cracked. Robert, meanwhile, maintained a deliberate calm, going about his life as if the flag were simply another part of the landscape, refusing to acknowledge the fury that followed him in Karen's narrowed eyes. Yet beneath that calm, he was not complacent. He knew that someone like Karen, whose authority depended not on law but on intimidation, would never accept the humiliation of being outmaneuvered in public view. He expected retaliation, and when it came, it arrived not with open confrontation but with paperwork once again sharpened into a weapon. A letter appeared in his mailbox on a humid morning, stamped with the association's seal, accusing him of repeated violations of neighborhood regulations and imposing fines that, if unpaid, would accrue interest. The accusations were absurd, ranging from unapproved exterior modifications to the supposed improper storage of building materials, claims so vague that they could not be disproven without first acknowledging their legitimacy. It was a tactic as old as bureaucracy itself. Drown the opponent in paper until resistance feels futile. Robert read the letter slowly, each line confirming what he had anticipated, and then set it aside without haste. He would not be baited into frantic denials. Instead, he turned his attention to preparing his defense in a language Karen could not easily twist. His decision was to document everything meticulously, not through photographs or sensational gestures, but through the very records that Karen manipulated. He filed requests for copies of every fine ever issued in the neighborhood, every demolition order, every permit granted or denied. At first, the clerk at the county office hesitated, hinting that such records were cumbersome to compile. But Robert, with the patience of a man who had spent a career dealing with resistant archives, insisted, citing the state's own public access statutes. Slowly, the documents arrived, thick envelopes that filled his desk with the weight of years. As he read, patterns emerged. Fines disproportionately levied against those who had opposed Karen in meetings, demolitions carried out without full votes, signatures suspiciously uniform across different years. The deeper he looked, the clearer it became that the forgery of his own consent was not an isolated act but part of a culture of falsification that had long sustained Karen's grip on the community. Armed with this knowledge, Robert returned to the association meeting 2 weeks later, not to protest this time, but to present, calmly and without flourish, a series of pointed questions. He asked why 3 different residents, all of whom had moved away, were still recorded as having voted on recent measures. He asked why fines were levied on homes that had since been purchased by people with close ties to the HOA board. He asked why the office itself, which occupied a disputed ground, had never faced review. His tone was steady, his demeanor controlled, but each question landed like a hammer blow against the brittle facade of legitimacy. The other residents, so long accustomed to silence, shifted uneasily, glancing not at him but at one another, and for the first time he sensed the possibility of fracture. Karen, however, responded with the venom of a cornered predator. She accused him of harassment, of misusing public records, of seeking to undermine the stability of the neighborhood for personal revenge. Her words flowed with rehearsed outrage, but Robert noticed the tightness in her voice, the faint quiver that betrayed strain. She attempted to rally the others, reminding them of their duty to protect property values and to reject those who threatened the harmony of the community. Yet harmony had become a hollow word, and the more she repeated it, the more the others seemed to recognize its emptiness. The escalation was not confined to the meetings. Robert began to notice small disturbances around his home. A letter torn from his mailbox and left crumpled on the sidewalk, his trash bins overturned on collection day, and once a faint smear of paint across his gate as though someone had begun to vandalize it but lost their nerve. He recognized these not as random mischief but as the subtle tactics of pressure, intended to unsettle, to remind him that he was being watched. He refused to be provoked. Instead, he installed stronger locks, repaired the damage without complaint, and continued gathering evidence. The true battle, he understood, was not in the petty harassments, but in the records, the signatures, the contradictions that revealed how fragile Karen's dominion truly was. When the next meeting arrived, the tension in the air was palpable. Karen attempted to open with a prepared statement condemning rogue actions and warning of serious consequences for those who disrespected the authority of the board. But before she could conclude, Robert rose and calmly placed a stack of documents on the table, copies of records that showed her own violations, her own manipulations, her own encroachment upon the municipal land. He did not shout or accuse. He simply read passages aloud, dates and names and inconsistencies that anyone with eyes could see. For the first time, silence fell not on him but on her. The room did not erupt into rebellion. Not yet, but the balance had shifted. The residents, long cowed into obedience, now saw that the emperor's clothes were woven of paper and lies. Karen's face hardened into a mask of composure, but her knuckles whitened on the edge of the table. Robert sat down without another word, leaving the evidence before them like an unmovable monument. The escalation was complete. What had begun as a struggle over a single flagpole had become a struggle over the very credibility of the association itself, and Karen, for all her bluster, could no longer pretend that her rule was unquestioned. The inevitable confrontation arrived not with stealth but with the full weight of procedure. A hearing convened in a rented hall where the association sought to reclaim the authority Robert had stripped from it piece by piece. The notice had come weeks earlier, a thick envelope filled with accusations written in the heavy language of legal formality, charging him with noncompliance, defamation, harassment, and even trespass for the act of raising the flag upon the roof of their office. Robert read each page carefully, felt the intent behind every phrase, and understood that this was Karen's last attempt to crush him not through petty fines or whispers, but through a decisive act meant to leave him cornered, humiliated, and silenced. He refused to be intimidated. Instead, he prepared with the same meticulous care that had carried him through a lifetime of preserving fragile structures against collapse. On the day of the hearing, the hall filled with residents, some drawn by curiosity, others by quiet hope that perhaps the order of things might finally shift. At the long table sat Karen and her board, each dressed in the stiff formality of those who mistake presentation for power. She spoke first, her voice firm and rehearsed, recounting Robert's supposed violations as though reading from a script written for a hostile audience. She described him as disruptive, as reckless, as a man who endangered the integrity of the neighborhood by placing his personal pride above the collective good. She pointed to documents that bore his name, signatures he had never written, votes that had never been cast, and wielded them as weapons, hoping their appearance of legitimacy would outweigh the truth. When it was his turn, Robert did not rush. He stood slowly, placed a carefully organized binder on the podium, and began not with fiery accusations but with quiet precision. He recounted the removal of his flagpole, the forged documents, the fabricated minutes, each supported by copies of records and inconsistencies too glaring to be dismissed. He presented the survey maps that showed the association office extending beyond its lawful boundary, the building permits that had never been updated, and the list of residents whose names had been used long after they had left the community. His tone was steady, his words measured, as if he were an architect walking a group of clients through a building's foundation, pointing out cracks invisible at first glance but undeniable once revealed. The effect was profound. The room, which had bristled with Karen's authority moments before, now shifted under the weight of evidence that could not be waved away. Karen attempted to recover, interrupting with indignation, accusing him of fabricating his own records, of twisting details for revenge. But the more she protested, the more her composure frayed, her voice rising, her gestures sharp and frantic. When Robert produced the folder containing the forged signature attributed to him, placing it side by side with his actual handwriting from notarized documents, the comparison was so damning that murmurs spread through the audience. A board member, one of her closest allies, shifted uncomfortably, and when Robert asked him directly whether he had ever seen Robert at the meeting where the supposed authorization was signed, the man hesitated before admitting that he had not. That hesitation, small and reluctant though it was, pierced the armor Karen had so carefully built. The climax arrived not in shouting but in the collapse of her credibility. The chair of the independent review panel, an attorney brought in to oversee the dispute, leaned forward and asked Karen to explain how signatures of departed residents had appeared on recent votes. Her answer faltered, first deflecting, then stammering, and at last collapsing into silence. The panel declared the evidence sufficient to invalidate the fines, to annul the accusations, and to refer the matter for further investigation into potential misconduct by the board. For the first time, Karen's power did not simply waver, it broke. The flag above the office, once derided as vandalism, was recognized as a symbol of his resilience, and the audience, long subdued, now turned its attention to her not with fear, but with suspicion. Robert sat down, his pulse steady, his binder closed before him like a finished project. He did not smile, did not revel in triumph because what had unfolded was not a victory of ego but the collapse of a false edifice, as inevitable as the fall of a structure built on sand. He knew the battle was not over, that bureaucracies rarely die cleanly, but he also knew that the myth of Karen's invincibility had been shattered in front of everyone. And in that moment, beneath the silent gaze of the flag rippling above the hall, he felt the calm weight of justice settle around him like the completion of a building that would endure. When the hearing ended and the crowd dispersed into the cool evening, Robert did not linger to savor the murmurs or the sidelong glances cast toward Karen as she retreated, stiff-backed and pale, into the corner of the hall. He walked home slowly, the binder tucked beneath his arm, the air carrying the faint sound of the flag as it cracked against the pole above the HOA office, its presence now transformed from an act of rebellion into a visible reminder that authority, without truth, cannot stand forever. In the days that followed, small changes rippled through the neighborhood. Where once there had been silence when he passed, now there were cautious nods, hesitant greetings, even murmured thanks from residents who had long resented the suffocating control but had lacked the courage to resist. He did not bask in their approval, for he understood that most had turned not out of conviction, but out of the recognition that the spell of fear had been broken. Still, the isolation that had pressed upon him for so long began to ease, and the streets that had felt hostile now seemed to breathe again. Karen herself did not vanish, but her power withered quickly. Stripped of her authority as chair, facing inquiries into her forged documents and illegal expansions, she could no longer command with the same effortless disdain. She appeared less often in public, her once constant presence at the center of neighborhood life reduced to brief, strained appearances, and even those who had loyally echoed her decrees now avoided her gaze. The board was reshaped under interim leadership, and though Robert refused suggestions that he take a formal role, he did offer his knowledge quietly, advising on procedures, ensuring that minutes were properly recorded, that boundaries were respected, that the machinery of governance returned to something closer to fairness. As for the flag, it did not come down. After much discussion, the board voted to allow it to remain until the matter of the office's property lines could be resolved, and by the time the investigation concluded months later, the sight of it had become so ordinary that no one imagined removing it. Robert eventually restored a new pole to his own lawn as well, this time with permits in perfect order and foundations stronger than before, and when the wind carried both banners together, the one above his home and the one above the very building that had tried to erase him, he felt no surge of victory, only a quiet sense of balance restored. The struggle had not been about dominance but about the right to stand without falsehood pressing down, and in that respect he had succeeded. He returned to his work, to the slow and patient labor of preserving structures others would neglect, knowing that his greatest preservation here had not been of steel or fabric, but of integrity itself.